Greetings, stranger, and welcome to Ghastly Tales. Here you will find stories to chill your bones, stop your heart, and tear at your very soul. Now, pull up close to the fire and listen closely. Tonight we bring you a tale of the hidden world, of murder and magic, of good and evil, order and chaos, and of the secret battles that rage around us unseen. This is The Case of the Black Lodge by Vlek.
A group of us had sequestered regularly at the country home of one of the most notable and accomplished men of this age, the great traveller, scholar, author, and detective of all things arcane and terrifying to the faint of heart, Geoffrey Sykes Vermillion. On the last Friday of each month, we gathered at the crumbling estate on Heath Lane, just an hour's drive outside the city, where we would dine on the superior comestibles of Vermillion's table, and then retire to the study to be warmed by the most excellent brandy I have ever consumed, and chilled by the most singular and curious tales. The ritual endured without variation for some years, and had become quite the routine. Our number never wavered, and the 7 of us, plus our good host, had grown well accustomed to one another. We suffered the presence of no outsiders or diminution of our party, unless by the most urgent of pressing matters, and guarded rather jealously the parameters and locale of our association. Suffice it to say that on that blustery late October evening when we retired to Vermillion's darkened study after an excellent rib roast and fresh asparagus, only to find another already seated there in the shadows, we were taken aback, and damn well not pleased. Decorum required we abstain from protest and silently awaited our host's explanation. We took to our regular perches, snifters in hand, and said explanation was soon forthcoming. "At ease, gentlemen. Our visitor," Vermillion said, gesturing broadly towards the figure seated by the fire, "is Miss Allegra Barlow. As I relate the harrowing details of her story, I'm sure you will glean why I have asked her to join us here this evening." He paused for a moment, as our eyes adjusted to what meagre light the blazing fire on the hearth and the few candles provided, and we had a chance to discreetly examine Miss Barlow. She was a stunningly handsome and imposing figure, tall and willow-fine as she sat, with cropped and bobbed copper-coloured hair, and the raiment of both the smart flapper and the lady of no small material means. I detected a mountain of luxurious furs tossed casually over the other end of the lounge on which she sat. Despite her great beauty and poise as she sat before us, I felt an inexplicable caution as we discerned this was no flippant girl or woman of the ordinary sort, but rather a creature of profound dignity and personal bearing. I'm sure we all assumed she must be among the foreign royalty currently holidaying in town, or an important personage of vast worldly accomplishment. All of this, and none of it as it happens, was true. But hear of it in Vermillion's own words. "I am acquainted with Miss Barlow through certain channels of my own, and we have shared our thoughts on many subjects of keen interest to us both on frequent occasions over the years of our association. When an urgent note arrived asking me to join her at her residence last week, I went at once, certain that no frivolous social call would be solicited by such a person, especially in the middle of the night." Vermillion paused to refill our glasses, nodding at the lady and noting her refusal with a swift movement of her hand. Though her face remained partly obscured, I sensed with every fibre of my being that we were being scrutinized in minute detail by eyes that were neither impressed nor charmed by our manly prowess and virtues, nor by the costly and fashionable cut of our suits and waistcoats. It was only Vermillion's relaxed and pleasant demeanour toward the woman that encouraged my own hackles to flatten against my back, and my body to relax into my seat. No odious creature or bane enemy would be invited into this house, nor would any possibly gain egress against the resolute will of its formidable resident. When I arrived at Miss Barlow's home, he continued, it was well past midnight, but she was still in full evening dress, and the large formal reception room was rudely ransacked. But it was the other curious details that commanded our attentions. The body on the doorstep, bloodied, broken, and stripped of its clothing, settled my mind on the nature of the late-night call to arms. Before I proceed, certain aspects of Miss Barlow's curriculum vitae must be revealed if you are to understand the extent of our association and the gravity of her predicament. Allegra, Miss Barlow, is the lodge mistress of Anubis Lodge, the Grand Lodge of the Order of... Well, I will leave certain details to Miss Barlow's privacy, perhaps later, if time permits. His words trailed off as he watched my companions and I shift uneasily in our seats. Miss Barlow's home, located in a guarded location, is one of the largest private dwellings in town, and serves as her home and as the temple for the Anubis Lodge. She has renovated the mansion at great personal expense and with formidable resources, and the results are a stunning tableau that any high-born Nubian priest of antiquity would bristle with pride to preside over. But on the night in question, Miss Barlow had just returned from an evening in the country. What she discovered was her front door shattered, the place a shambles, and her servants viciously murdered. You are probably wondering why she called me instead of the more orthodox criminal authorities. Our association, of course, notwithstanding, it was the severity of the crime and the identity of the suspects that caused my name to spring most naturally to mind. You see, the initiates of Anubis Lodge had been engaged in something of a war with the Black Lodge for some time, and things, you might say, had finally come to a head. Despite my years of experience and familiarity with death, both murder most foul and mundane, as well as that steeped in the timbre of the macabre and worlds unseen, what unfolded in the wee hours of the morning within the walls of Anubis Lodge was chilling and most foul indeed. Now, attend to what I am about to say, for it will undoubtedly be among the most shocking revelations of all that I have shared with you regarding the occult side of my dealings, which, up to now, you may have assumed I merely dabbled in. Not so. The other reason my dear friend Allegra called me onto the case is because of my expertise in certain rites and practices found among the highest and most obscured valleys in Tibet. I refer to Bone, the precursor to the coming of Buddhism in Tibet, and the teachings of its sorceress lamas. Now be still, I see you lot bristling in your seats. Not all that's dark is evil, and subtlety is what makes this world of ours an interesting and tolerable place. I had spent some years in Tibet and had become familiar with its hidden mysteries. But more on this later. The denizens of the Black Lodge do not partake of the paths and practices of Bone, but my adepthood in these matters had proven quite useful on other occasions, outside the usual occult mummery most spiritualists get up to these days. Nothing on the tragic scene at Anubis Lodge had been tampered with in any way before my arrival. Allegra and I made cursory and then more in-depth investigations into all that we discovered. Then I learned more of the aforementioned war with the Black Initiates. The first body, that of poor old William, found naked on the very threshold of the front door, was arranged in a most provocative display, with arms and legs twisted bizarrely in a manner unlikely to be happenstance. It was Allegra who pointed out the similarity of the misshapen body to a certain noxious sigil used by the elders of the Black Lodge to gain entry to places from which they are otherwise strictly barred. You might well ask, how was such a powerful edifice of the arcane arts as the Lodge of Anubis so easily breached when, I can assure you, the lady seated with us this evening is fully capable of guarding her fortresses. How indeed. As the story unfolded, the Black Lodge had infiltrated the Anubis stronghold in seeming good faith when various of their members had staged a defection from their ranks and sought asylum and spiritual sanctum with Allegra and her initiates. 5 members of the Black Lodge had left their former order and had taken initiation into the way of Anubis. Over time they learned enough of her secrets to mount an attack. Seduction is a powerful and dangerous thing. The original 5 interlopers had managed to turn 5 more Anubians to their own schemes, and greater secrets sprang open at their touch. Allegra had learned of this treachery and through various means had determined the scope and nature of the plot and the identity of the infected, among which was her own young cousin. Indeed, the purpose of the sojourn in the countryside that very night had been to deploy certain measures with the help of a sister lodge, and to gather the troops to clean house at Anubis Lodge and rid the place of the spectral infestation. After carefully examining William's body and confirming the dread sigil arranged upon his poor broken limbs, the mistress of the lodge escorted me to the temple room, where the remaining victims were found in the most distasteful disarray. Like William, the butler's body was mangled, but he was stretched out in a horrid, elongated manner and twisted about to form the image of a snake devouring its tail. I shall leave further details to your imaginations, but the obscene spectacle did not in the least resemble Ouroboros. Again, the sigil was familiar to the lady and myself as that depicting an act of vile desecration of the human form, and the mark sacred to a certain denizen of the black pathways that I shall not name here aloud. Further lurid discoveries took the form of the cook, the chambermaid, a chore lad, and the night attendant of the sacred temple itself, the inner sanctum that none but initiates may enter. Together and conjoined, the bodies of these 6 poor wretches, these 6 sigils, formed the great black wheel sacred to the enemy lodge, and created an opening, a birthing way, by which all that is good and noble within the Anubian path may be sucked away and perverted into nefarious energies, and all that is unholy, vile, and unclean may enter into the world to cavort and frolic about at will. A soft thud rocked me from my rapt absorption with Vermilion's voice, and I noticed my snifter had dropped from my hand and rolled across the carpet. I quickly retrieved it, only to realize my companion still sat mesmerized and oblivious of my clumsy blunder. For his part, our host shot me a reassuring glance and continued with his story. Allegra and I concluded our thorough investigation of the horrid intrusion and the sad bodies of her servants. Then we called the so-called proper authorities and ushered them into the house to do their worst. Against all normal procedure and propriety, however, we spirited the final affront from the premises before the authorities arrived and secured it at a far remove from the house. It had lain upon the floor of the inner temple itself and formed the very substance of profanity. The thing reeked of the charnel house and the public toilets all at once, and we had to wrap our faces before we saw to its needs. The abomination must have been alive, after some manner of speaking, and it had not, hopefully, ever been human. The thing was circular and flat as a large black pancake formed of a tar-like substance and other indiscernible matter, and measured about 8 feet in diameter. As hideous as it sounds, for the life of me the thing resembled nothing so much as an infernal black placenta, and I have no doubt that it served some such or similar purpose in the night's proceedings. Needless to say, when we disposed of the thing, it was thoroughly and utterly dead. We saw to that. Then it was burned and buried. This brought me sharply around, and I gasped and heard my companions groaning and shaking their heads. What was Vermilion about? Why was he telling us all this when, before, his tales, as uncommon and unbelievable as many and steeped in occult lore and shenanigans as they were, remained the stuff of damned good yarns that didn't cause the hackles and bile to rise among the company? We had no recourse but to hear the story to its conclusion, so we settled back and tossed off another round of drinks, in hopes of good wholesome fortification arising thereby. The next day, after the authorities had removed all sad human remains, the mistress of the lodge gathered her flock, and we set to work. I had returned home briefly to gather the implements and artifacts peculiar to my trade, and certain ritual garments appropriate to such adventures, and then returned to the Anubis Lodge, where things were progressing apace. Now, lest you erroneously assume that the good mages of Anubis Lodge and their mistress are not capable of mounting the necessary return of martial volleys without calling in outside assistance such as myself, note these 2 fine points. Firstly, the lady and I have quite a history together, and she has often called me in not as saviour but as colleague and partner. Secondly, one must understand that the various forms of magic, occult studies, arcane spiritualities and the like form together the spokes of a great wheel of their own, and while they have overlapping qualities and areas of inquiry, each brings its own unique potency to bear upon any matter. You may recall the tale of the elephant and the 5 blind men. Each grasps a part of the beast and believes it to be the whole. The man in front grabs the trunk and believes the elephant is a snake, another bloke embraces a leg and swears the creature is a tree. Another takes the animal's body for a wall, and so on. When we assembled in the temple room to mount our counter-assault upon the Black Lodge, the Anubians were regaled in their glorious robes of office and degree. Their sacred weapons and sigils of honour emblazoned proudly. For my part, I wore naught but the black robes of my office, that of negation, and the unfathomed deeps of space and no space, such as my mentors the Lamas had initiated me into, among those desolate icy peaks and obscured mountain valleys. When we began, Allegra took her place at the centre of the congregation and performed 4 vanishings, each more potent and arcane than its predecessor. Certain incenses were set alight and the heady smoke filled the room. Then we fell into the deep and ordered reverie that forms the basic working rite of the lodge. I sat outside the circle of Anubians, and together Allegra and I intoned certain formulas we had composed for the purpose, and that must needs never be uttered again thereafter. We had not long to wait, as the enemy lodge must have been decamped nearby in the seldom travelled corners of adjacent space to await the throwing of the gauntlet to the floor. Within moments, the clean, fragrant smoke of the temple incense was dispelled by oily, noxious fumes that reeked of burning rubber and animal dung. Following Allegra's lead, we covered our faces with the sashes from our robes and steeled our resolve. The initiates closed the gap between them and locked arms where they sat, as Allegra commanded the centre of the temple.
I was the first to see them,
came an unfamiliar but clear and beautiful voice. I looked up to see our guest standing next to Vermilion where he sat. He had grown silent, and the Lady of Anubis Lodge now commanded our attention, and we uttered not a sigh of resistance but rather sat like terrified and besotted schoolboys before the magnificent woman, who seemed to completely fill the room with her radiant, peaceful presence.
They clung to the floorboards and grew in size and number until they formed a swollen, unbroken chain round the perimeter of the circular room. Throbbing lumps of pale translucence, they trembled with an inner glow that almost made them appear beautiful, had we not known their thoroughly evil origins. They were the larvae, and we shuddered at their sight but maintained our vigilance. Some of the younger among my company gaped but remained in their places, having never seen such corporeal manifestation of the uncreated before. The larvae were but the footmen of our enemy, and I silently urged my companions to ignore them. Soon they dissolved and drifted away like mist that clings to gravestones at moontide.
As I rose to begin my turns, a sickly green film seemed to fall across the room, and I knew my enemy was at hand. It was difficult to walk, as though I dreamed or walked against a heavy current, but I continued on. I started walking the perimeter of the room, weaving in and out among my companions, and resuming my course along the wall. It was in this way that the enemy engaged with me. Our two paths are so similar in many ways, yet so very unlike in others, but we are familiar to one another. It was something like a dance that this invisible spectre led me through, as we each took the measure of the other, in the way hesitant lovers mirror the beloved. With my right index finger pointed towards the floor like a dagger, and my left hand fanning through the air, I gathered and repelled the energies that filled the room, and I knew my enemy did the same. I had never met the spectre in the flesh, but I knew he was a man, the master of the Black Lodge, and that he had his minions, allies, and servitors, as did I. What he brought to bear upon me was hideous in the extreme, yet I held him at bay and sensed that he was surprised by this. He thought that since he had raided the henhouse and robbed me of the worst among my flock, that I was sufficiently weakened for him to take me. He pressed down hard upon me, and once, twice, 3 times he almost brought me to my knees. I heard one of my companions crying, and I shot him a stern glance that bolstered his nerves and silenced him. When I felt that my enemy had grown arrogant and confident, I glanced at my old friend, and the greatest adept lama of the bone path of sorcery outside of Tibet rose slowly in his black robes, and joined me at my side. The deep throaty chanting rose in Vermilion's chest. The woman continued. It became a cacophony that drowned out the muttering and other noises that now filled the chamber. Then Vermilion left my side, and I heard the sound of something heavy dropping to the floor. My flesh tingled with terror and delight, and I longed to join him. The soft padding of feet plodded quickly widdershins opposite to the dance I resumed about the chamber. I dared not glance at Vermilion as he made his way around the room, and silently forbade my companions from doing so either. But I knew. I had seen on 2 other occasions the great black tiger that guarded my friend's soul, and which came to full material manifestation within his flesh when called. As my companions and I enacted a rite of Western magic to defeat this oh-so-Western enemy, my good friend Vermilion enacted the black meal rite of the bone cults, knowing the spirit tiger would be a thing unknown, unrecognized by the enemy and his acolytes, and my own fallen companions who had joined him. The sounds of snuffling, growling, and the ripping apart of something by great claws was accompanied by screams, and the fearful wailing of my initiates. I continued my dance, stabbing at the earth with one hand, grasping all I could from the airs and ethers around me with the other. As I walked, I noticed a sticky substance had begun to gather on the floor, and the scents that rose were both sickly sweet and suffocating. I renewed my invocations and heard my companions growing bolder and joining in. First one, and then another stood and joined in the circle I navigated around the room, oblivious of the giant black tiger that sped past them in the opposite direction. All of a sudden, there was a breathless pause, as if an unseen hand swept back a heavy curtain and let in breezes from places long forgotten by our frail human sensibilities. A screaming torrent sounded as a black waterfall of pure unmanifest chaos, the mother of all impossible evils, poured into the room and then halted in perfect silence as a crushing weight threatened to bear us all to the ground. The moment had come, and only all of our efforts together could push back that dark tide. I heard a ferocious snarl and a roar that almost ruptured my eardrums. I collapsed on the ground as the form of a great black tiger leapt over me and into the waterfall. Then, both disappeared, and all was silent, empty. as though we had yet to even begin the evening's activities. Somewhere outside, I heard sirens. Many, many sirens and voices shouting. I got up and ran to the window and threw back the heavy velvet drapes. In the distance, I saw a fire burning against the horizon of the night sky, as though half the city were being consumed by the gaping mouth of hell itself. I looked back at my companions, and all was still, as though we had spent the night in peaceful meditation. Vermilion stood in the center of the room, a man once more, his robes in disarray and torn in many places. He stood where I had stood, as though he had never left my side. I resumed my place beside him and bid my companions rise. I put my right finger to my lips and cast it sharply away. "So it is done," I said firmly, and was answered by the entire company in like kind. Then we closed the temple and departed. The next day we learned that the fire had been started in the long abandoned tunnels under the old part of the city and had consumed almost a mile of the ancient timber-lined subterranean passageway. We heard reports of dozens of burned bodies down there, as well as the remains of a large quantity of mysterious flotsam and jetsam of occult antiquity. The Black Lodge had found a fitting home and final resting place in that blackened charnel pit. The woman finished talking. Then she went to the sideboard and poured herself a snifter quite full of Vermilion's best, and returned to her seat among the shadows. "And so you see, my friends, it is done," Vermilion said at last. We just sat there, dumbfounded. Surely none of it could be true. But knowing Vermilion, who could tell? If it was true, what the damned hell were we supposed to make of it all? "It is done," Vermilion bellowed again, raising his glass to us and to the lady mistress of Anubis Lodge, who smartly returned his salute. "We are done here with this little gentleman's club, I think, of boyish feasting and storytelling," he added, refilling his glass and tossing it sharply back and gesturing for us to do the same, which we did. The others looked at me, and I at them as we awaited further instructions, or to be thrown out into the night or laughed at for our gullibility. "So it is done," Vermilion continued, taking his seat. "We are no longer 8. We are 9, if the lady will have us. We will undertake a new line of inquiry and begin a deeper exploration of these matters you good fellows claim to be so interested in. But be of good cheer. From what I understand, 9 is a very auspicious number."
This has been a Ghastly Tales production. Narration by Martin Yates, story by Aaron Vlek. Accompanying music by Kevin MacLeod, with additional music by Michael Whitehouse. For full credits, please see the description. I hope you've enjoyed this reading. If you have, please subscribe to Ghastly Tales on YouTube and stalk Ghastly Tales Presents on Facebook for more horror narrations, short films, true horrors, dark documentaries, and more. And for chills on the go, remember that our narrations are available as the Ghastly Tales Horror Show on iTunes, Libsyn, and all good podcasting apps. Good night, listener, and sweet dreams.